Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're going to explore what it means and what to do if you're starting to suspect, or maybe have already begun to recognize, that one of your parents might have covert narcissistic traits. This can be hard to identify because unlike the more obvious, grandiose narcissism, covert narcissism often hides behind subtle behaviors. Guilt induction, withdrawal, or a quiet sense, and I put quiet in quotes, I'll come back to that later, but a quiet sense of victimhood. Examples are always helpful in bringing these dynamics to life. Before we jump into a prototypical scenario of how covert narcissism presents in both the parent and the child, it's important to first review some of the main defining characteristics of covert narcissism. By understanding these traits, we can start to unpack the unconscious forces at play and see why the impact is often felt so deeply by the child well into their adult life. So, what are the defining characteristics of covert narcissism? In other words, how will you know if you or someone close to you is struggling with characteristics related to covert narcissism? Let's break these down. Both grandiose and covert narcissism share traits such as a limited capacity for empathy, chronic envy, and superficial relationships, just to name a few. They also display the defining feature of a grandiose sense of self, which includes a constant need for admiration. There are key features that set covert narcissism apart from their more overt counterparts. Here are some of the predominant characteristics. And I say predominant features because I don't want to overwhelm you with a long laundry list of traits, but instead focus on those that I have found to be most relevant to understand. I'll first describe these traits, and then I'll give you an example to demonstrate the subtle ways they tend to appear in real life. Heightened sensitivity to criticism. Unlike overt narcissists, covert narcissists react intensely to perceived slights. Their responses may take the form of sadness, withdrawal, or subtle resentment, quiet or covert rage, rather than open or overt rage. And again, I'll illustrate this by way of example in a moment. Subtle manipulation. They maintain control through indirect means, such as passive-aggressive behavior, chronic complaining, or positioning themselves as the injured party. This allows them to appear vulnerable while still pulling others into their orbit. Victim mentality. They often see themselves as perpetually wronged, which helps them avoid taking responsibility for their own emotions while drawing sympathy, attention, and care from others. Hidden, or again, covert grandiosity. Despite outward humility or introversion, covert narcissists hold on to fantasies of specialness and superiority, even if these beliefs remain unspoken. This is the grandiose structure that I mentioned earlier, and I'll elaborate on this in a moment. Psychodynamically, what's happening beneath these traits is that the covert narcissist struggles with a very fragile sense of self and precarious self-esteem. The child, or anyone close to them, is often unconsciously recruited to stabilize their shaky inner world. We could pull many of these traits together if you think about this question. Have you ever felt that your role with a parent was less about being yourself and more about keeping the peace, or constantly trying to prevent them from getting upset? That's the position children of covert narcissists often find themselves in, quietly, unconsciously, we would say in my field, pulled into managing and propping up the parent's fragile inner self. Let's look at a prototypical example of how these traits show up between a covert narcissistic parent and a child. Growing up with a parent who hides their narcissism behind subtle manipulation, guilt, or a victim stance can be deeply confusing. On the surface, they may seem loving, caring, or selfless, but underneath, their behavior often leaves you feeling unseen, guilty, or responsible for their emotions and for hurting them. Here is a prototypical scenario that captures how this dynamic often unfolds. A patient of mine, the adult child of a covert narcissist perhaps, was accepted into a prestigious graduate program and shared the excited news with her mother. Almost immediately, the mother shifted the focus away from her daughter's accomplishment to her own distress. She stated something like, "We need to talk about how this is going to affect our relationship. I just need to share my feelings with you." The very next day, again, not giving her daughter much time to process this, the very next day, the mother became highly emotional, saying she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter moving away. Through tears, she warned that if her daughter left, it would, and I quote, "ruin everything," and even called it the worst thing that could happen. For the daughter, this wasn't new. Years earlier, at another important milestone, her high school graduation, her mother had responded in much the same way. Instead of celebrating, she expressed overwhelming sadness about being alone and indirectly, that's the key word here, indirectly discouraged her daughter from going away to college. Why can a parent's seemingly innocent request to just share my feelings feel like something you can't refuse? Perhaps the invitation carries hidden pressure or obligation just beneath the surface. The patient's preoccupation with her mother's request to talk about and share her feelings about whether to attend graduate school may reveal a deeper unconscious conflict around separation, loyalty, and emotional responsibility in her family system. From a psychodynamic perspective, the mother's distress is likely less about the present day acceptance to graduate school or the living logistics, and more about her own unresolved feelings tied to her own earlier experiences of what? Separation and loss. The crying and what I came to label as catastrophic statement, that was, remember, "it will ruin everything," suggests a reactivation of an older injury, likely rooted in the mother's own abandonment anxieties or unresolved grief. Just a quick aside, I've also seen this pressure expressed more covertly. For example, when a parent becomes sharply critical of the school her daughter chooses to attend, sending an implicit message, "Why would you want to go to that school?" And you know what the rest of that statement is, right? "When you could stay closer to home." The intensity of the mother's tears and catastrophic language, again, just to remind you, "This is the worst thing ever," that functions less as a deliberate manipulation, like it's not consciously planned, and more as an unconscious attempt to pull her daughter into an emotional state where she's more reactive rather than reflective. Her daughter, my patient, internalizes this as her responsibility. She feels as though she caused her mother's emotional state, and this guilt begins to eclipse her own needs. She even starts to contemplate abandoning her graduate program in order to protect her mother from what? From having to experience any painful feelings. Why does the request to just share my feelings from her mother carry such weight? I hope I'm beginning to make clear that unconsciously it threatens the child's deepest fear, that her independence, that's going off to school in this example, might shatter the bond and leave her mother feeling hurt and overwhelmed. We slowly come to discover that inner, again, not yet conscious feelings, as the child of a covert narcissistic parent include, but are not limited to, 1. She steps into the role of an emotional caregiver for her mother, a role familiar to her from earlier in life when her parents divorced and her mother turned to her, and I'm quoting this, like a best friend. This is an example of what we would call a role reversal. Some people call it parentification. 2. She feels a strong pull to merge her separate wishes into her mother's wishes so that the bond, and I quote, the bond feels intact. This reflects a merger fantasy, something I've discussed in far more detail in prior episodes, something that's really common among people who have these narcissistic traits, where individuation is experienced as abandonment and therefore must be avoided at all cost. And finally, the mother's distress endangers her own attachment security. The unconscious conflict becomes, if she pursues, that's the daughter, if she pursues her own desires and autonomy, she risks both hurting her mother and losing her mother's love. And that's breaking the bond, which she too depends on, by the way. You can imagine how trapped a child might feel in that moment, torn between her own growth and her mother's emotional collapse.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. When thinking about the inner world of a child who has a covert narcissistic parent, we need to slow down and listen closely to her inner logic, the unconscious reasoning that keeps her bound and bound, right, to her mother's needs at the expense of her own needs and desires. We see this internal logic not only in the decision to leave for school, but across many major life transitions. A covert narcissistic parent's tears, criticisms, or subtle manipulation can leave a child feeling that their own growth or joy is somehow dangerous. It might surface when leaving for college or graduate school, starting a first job, moving in with a partner, planning a wedding, preparing to have a baby, or even in something as ordinary as a parent insisting on how the baby should be dressed. For some sons, it can emerge around choices like buying a first car, spending time with a girlfriend's family, which is a big one, I hear this frequently, or pursuing a particular career path. In each case, the child is made to feel guilty for separating or investing in his own life, but the guilt rarely ever appears in such a straightforward way. Instead, it often comes through subtle criticisms or worries, and I put worries in quotes, such as disparaging remarks or about a girlfriend or her family, right? Criticisms about the girlfriend, in other words, or doubts about whether they've chosen the career that is really the right one, or questioning whether the son is being irresponsible with the way he spends his free time or money. In all of these examples, the implicit message beneath these comments is always the same. You hear it? What is it? Prioritizing one's own growth risks hurting the parent. The child is therefore pulled between the loyalty to the parent's emotional needs and the natural drive toward independence. So what is actually going on inside the child's mind in these moments? How does she justify setting aside her own desire to attend graduate school in this example to stabilize her mother's mood? Through reflection, we could see how her unconscious reasoning not to move forward in her life unfolded. As we began to notice her own patterns, her inner thoughts became clearer, and they sounded a little something like this. If I don't leave for school, I can keep my mother stable and safe, comfortable. We heard this. My happiness will ruin her, so I should minimize it. And this. If she's this upset now, just with the thought of me going to graduate school, imagine what she'll do if I actually leave. I have to prevent that from happening. And finally, this. I can't have both my freedom and my mother's love. Remember, there's the threat of losing the parent's love. So I have to choose, and choosing her is safer. Why safer? On the surface, it's clear this behavior is protecting the mother from these painful feelings. But can you imagine how it also protects the daughter, my patient? And why the need to protect her mother? From what you heard thus far, what do you think? Is the mother a covert narcissist? Or does the mother show covert narcissistic traits? The question on the table is, does the mother show covert narcissistic traits? I say yes. This scenario maps closely onto the covert narcissistic dynamics we discussed earlier. Here's why. We spoke about heightened sensitivity to criticism. The mother's intense, catastrophic emotional reaction over a decision about graduate school reflects hypersensitivity. Even a small, somewhat neutral announcement triggers a disappointment in her and a disproportionate response. That's the key. Her tears, and remember I said catastrophic language, the worst thing ever. This is the worst thing ever that can happen. Signal the quiet, simmering rage that often underlies covert narcissistic behavior, and which gets kicked off by heightened sensitivity. What else did we see? Subtle manipulation, or what we could call passive aggressiveness. By insisting she needs to share her feelings and framing the child's decision as a threat, the mother subtly manipulates the situation. She draws her daughter into the emotional labor of managing her distress and therefore attempts to prevent her from making an independent and autonomous decision. Earlier, I mentioned victimhood. With covert narcissists, their sense of being wronged is rarely quiet or hidden. But the covert part lies in how this victimhood is expressed. It subtly draws others in, creating emotional pressure or guilt, often without the narcissist openly, overtly, right, demanding, yelling, or controlling. So I hope that part became a little clearer, that this is victimhood, but it's kind of like a quiet victim because it goes on latently. I mean, they're overt in the sense that they can express feeling victimized, but the covert part is the way they maneuver people to take responsibility for their victimhood. So, in this example, by framing herself, that's the mother, as hurt and wounded by the daughter's decision to leave, the mother shifts focus from the daughter's accomplishments to her own needs, right? This is something to celebrate, but it becomes about the mother's need, making the daughter feel what? Either guilty or responsible for the mother's distress. By keeping the child emotionally engaged and constrained, the covert narcissist maintains control, even under the guise of expressing vulnerability. But this is still a form of control, make no mistake about it. And that's, by the way, part of the grandiose structure. This is an important point that we'll explore further because understanding this is key to figuring out how to manage, right? How to manage or how to respond to or set boundaries once you recognize that you may have a parent who's suffering with these covert narcissistic characteristics. So, We are still looking at this situation to see how the covert narcissistic traits we discussed earlier are fully at play. We already covered heightened sensitivity and subtle manipulation. And then I squeezed in an example of the grandiosity, the grandiose sense of self. But there is also, and I already went into this, but there's the grandiosity. That's the third thing I wanted to mention. Even if not openly expressed, this is what I was getting at earlier, there's a sense that the mother believes that her needs, feelings, and emotional perspective are paramount, deserving of immediate attention and accommodation. Her view of herself as essential to the child's choices reflects, there's the covert grandiosity. Stated differently, her mother experiences her acceptance into a graduate school not simply a joyful milestone, but as a narcissistically charged scenario that threatens her own grandiose sense of control. It becomes all about who? The mother, right? And therein lies the covert grandiosity, but covert because you don't hear that in any sort of overt way. You hear it through what? The suffering, the complaining, and inducing the guilt. An independent decision, something that may be good for the daughter, exposes vulnerabilities and triggers fears of abandonment. This reflects covert entitlement, an unconscious expectation that her daughter's choices should protect her own self-esteem. So in other words, the daughter should make choices that are good for who? Good for the mother. In sum, this one interaction illustrates how these covert traits converge. The mother's fragile self-esteem, hypersensitivity, victimhood, subtle manipulation, and an unspoken sense of grandiosity and importance, that her needs should always come first. So what now? If you're beginning to suspect or have already recognized that one of your parents may have covert narcissistic traits, this realization can feel both clarifying and unsettling. It explains why moments of joy often turn into guilt, why independence felt threatening, and why you were drawn into managing someone else's emotions at the expense of your own. But of course, once you recognize this, the next question becomes unavoidable. Now what? What do you do once you see this covert narcissistic pattern? Do you talk openly with your parent about your needs, your desire to attend graduate school, to go off to college, to spend time with your partner's family? Do you try to gray rock or even go no contact? Again, these are common buzzwords when dealing with narcissistic individuals. Do you try to develop thicker skin so you're not left feeling so hurt by their subtle but insidious criticisms? Do you keep trying to fix things so they don't feel the pain of separation? And what happens if you stop fixing things? Often, covert narcissistic parents become even more victimized, complain more, or escalate their emotional demands. How are you supposed to manage this without losing yourself in the process? These are the questions we'll take up in part 2. Through prototypical examples, I'll show you what I believe is really necessary. Not only practical strategies for dealing with a covert narcissistic parent, but also a deeper dive into the psychological work of separating. Not necessarily separating physically, though that may be part of it, but separating mentally and emotionally. That means facing the guilt, loosening the role of the fixer, the pleaser, and working through the codependent pull that keeps you bound to their needs. Whether you stay close or you create distance, the challenge is the same. How do you step into your own life, free of guilt and confusion? There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.